A black soldier returning home is stopped by an officer who questions everything about him. But what happens next shocks everyone and leads to a change nobody saw coming. Watch till the end to see how a tense moment turns into a lesson in respect and second chances. The airport buzzed with people moving in every direction, busy with suitcases and checking screens for flights. Lieutenant Samuel Ross walked calmly through the terminal, standing out in his clean-pressed military uniform. After a year overseas, he was finally on his way home, and the thought of seeing his family again made him feel lighter. He adjusted his duffel bag and took a deep breath, soaking in the feeling of being back on familiar ground. Across the terminal, Officer Richard Cole watched closely from his post. A security officer with over 20 years on the job, Richard was known for being sharp and always alert. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on Samuel. Something about Samuel's calmness struck him as unusual, his sharp instincts instantly stirring with suspicion. Why would a man in a military uniform be lingering here? To Richard, it seemed out of place. With a frown, Richard decided to approach Samuel, walking toward him with his gaze fixed. Samuel, too busy checking his phone to notice, was still thinking about the flight home and the family he couldn't wait to see. Suddenly, he heard a stern voice beside him. "Sir, I need to see your ID and boarding pass," Richard said, holding out his hand as if he wouldn't take no for an answer. Samuel looked up, surprised. For a moment, he didn't understand why he was being stopped, but he kept his cool. He'd been in far more intense situations. Calmly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his military ID and boarding pass, and handed them over. Richard took his time looking at the documents, studying Samuel's ID and scanning his boarding pass, his eyes flicking up and down with suspicion. Samuel stood quietly, watching Richard's reactions, sensing the distrust. The longer the silence dragged on, the more Samuel felt the irritation bubbling under his calm expression. Richard cleared his throat, glancing back at Samuel with a doubtful look. "Where are you headed?" he asked, as if expecting something to be wrong. "Home," Samuel replied steadily. "My connecting flight's in an hour." Richard nodded but continued holding onto the documents, his stare hard and suspicious, as if he expected Samuel to explain more. The noise of the terminal seemed to fade as they stood there. Two men locked in a silent, tense moment, each wondering what would happen next. Samuel held his ground, standing tall and calm as Richard's eyes moved back and forth from the documents to his face. He knew this look. It was the look of someone already convinced they'd found something wrong, even before they had a reason. Samuel had seen this expression many times and felt the sting of being sized up unfairly. But he kept his face steady, refusing to show frustration. This was just another challenge, one of many he'd faced. Richard handed back the ID and boarding pass, but the suspicion in his eyes hadn't faded. "And what branch did you say you were in?" he asked, crossing his arms, his tone laced with skepticism. "I'm in the Army," Samuel replied evenly. "I'm a lieutenant." Richard nodded, but his eyes remained cold. "And where were you stationed?" Samuel took a steady breath, sensing that answering wouldn't make much difference to this man. "Still," he replied, "overseas. Deployed in the Middle East." Richard's lips pursed, and his eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, as though he didn't quite buy it. "Uh-huh," he said, drawing out the sound in a way that made Samuel feel like he was being interrogated. "And you decided to come back in uniform, huh? Right in the middle of an airport?" Samuel felt the irritation rising, but he knew better than to react. He nodded calmly. "Yes, sir. Traveling in uniform isn't unusual." Richard's face hardened, and he stepped a little closer, his voice dropping. "We've had some issues around here. People pretending to be soldiers looking for special treatment, so I'll be honest with you. Something about this doesn't sit right." Samuel held his gaze, not backing down. "I'm not looking for any special treatment," he said, his voice firm. "I'm just here like everyone else, trying to get home." But Richard wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed, and he gave Samuel a look that said he still didn't trust him. "Then you won't mind answering a few more questions, will you?" Samuel felt the eyes of other travelers on them now. He could feel people slowing down, some looking openly curious, others subtly glancing over as they pretended to walk by. A couple of them held up their phones recording the scene, probably wondering why a man in uniform was being grilled like a criminal. Samuel wanted to end this, to just walk away, but he knew that resisting might make things worse. He looked Richard in the eyes and nodded. "Ask away." Richard's shoulders relaxed just slightly, as if he were satisfied to see that Samuel wasn't resisting. "Where's your family? You got anyone waiting for you here?" Samuel answered, keeping his tone steady. "I've got family back home, my wife and my daughter. I'm trying to get back to them." Richard seemed almost disappointed by the answer, like he'd hoped for something incriminating. He leaned in, his voice lowering. "So why haven't I seen you here before?" Samuel resisted the urge to laugh in disbelief. "Sir, I've been deployed. It's been a while since I've been anywhere in the States, let alone this airport." Richard crossed his arms again, clearly not fully satisfied. "Just seems strange, that's all," he muttered. "Military or not, I have to make sure everything checks out." Samuel met his gaze, still calm but growing tired of the exchange. "Everything does check out. If you'd like to confirm, I can provide contact info for my unit." For the first time, Richard hesitated, as if caught off guard by Samuel's steady confidence. But before he could respond, another officer walked over. A woman with a kind but firm face, her badge catching the light as she approached. Officer Kate Hernandez had heard the exchange from a distance and decided to step in. She'd served in the National Guard for a few years before joining airport security, and she knew a service member when she saw one. "Richard, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of authority. She glanced at Samuel, giving him a respectful nod before looking back at Richard with a raised eyebrow. Richard cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Just doing a routine check, making sure everything's in order." Kate gave him a skeptical look. "Routine? For a soldier returning home?" She turned to Samuel, her expression softening. "Lieutenant, thank you for your service," she said, nodding at his uniform with respect. "I'm sorry if this has been inconvenient." Samuel nodded back, sensing that she understood. "Thank you, Officer Hernandez." Kate glanced back at Richard, catching the tense look on his face. "Richard, you checked his ID, right? You verified his boarding pass?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Yeah, but something just feels off, you know. We've seen people faking it before." Kate crossed her arms, her voice steady but firm. "And yet he's presented all the documentation you asked for. He's wearing a uniform and carrying ID that checks out. That's enough for me." Richard opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself, looking around and noticing that a small crowd had gathered. The last thing he wanted was to look foolish in front of all these people, but he couldn't shake his suspicion. With a quiet huff, he finally looked back at Samuel. "Fine," he said, trying to mask his frustration. "Guess we're done here. You're free to go." Samuel gave a short nod, not allowing himself to relax until Richard had stepped back. But before he could move away, Kate spoke up. "Lieutenant Ross, I'd be happy to escort you to your gate if you'd like," she offered, her voice warm. "Just to make sure everything's smooth from here." Samuel appreciated the offer, sensing that she genuinely wanted to make things right. "Thank you, but I'll be all right," he said, giving her a respectful nod. He glanced at Richard one last time, his expression unreadable, before he turned to leave, blending back into the flow of travelers heading toward their gates. As Samuel walked away, Kate turned back to Richard, her face serious. "Richard, we don't need to be making people's lives harder than they already are, especially those who've served." Richard shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed. "I was just being careful." Kate's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "Maybe be a little careful with your assumptions, too. Not everyone deserves suspicion just because they don't fit your idea of right." Richard grumbled something under his breath, avoiding her gaze. But as he watched Samuel disappear into the crowd, A nagging thought crept into his mind, one he wasn't ready to face. As Samuel walked away from the tense scene, he could still feel the sting of Richard's cold, suspicious gaze. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the thought of finally seeing his family. But his mind kept circling back, wondering why someone like Richard would be so quick to judge him. He found a quiet seat near his gate, away from the bustling crowds, and dropped his bag at his feet. Taking a deep breath, he looked around, reminding himself he was home, or at least closer to it than he'd been in a long time. He should be excited right now, he thought, but Richard's questions lingered in his mind. Across the terminal, Richard leaned against a pillar, still fuming as he watched Samuel walk off. Kate's words echoed in his ears, hitting him harder than he'd expected. "Not everyone deserves suspicion just because they don't fit your idea of right," she'd said. He didn't want to admit it, but her words unsettled him. Richard had worked long enough to know when someone was lying, he told himself. He wasn't wrong to be cautious, right? But now he wasn't so sure. Kate walked back to him, arms crossed. She raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to say something. When he didn't, she spoke first. "Richard, you've been on this job a long time," she said, her tone softer than before. "You should know by now that people deserve respect, especially those who serve. You don't want a reputation as the guy who hassles the wrong people." Richard scowled, looking away. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. Kate sighed, shaking her head. "It's not just about doing the job. It's about doing it right." Before Richard could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of Captain Laura Benson, head of airport security. She was a firm, no-nonsense leader with a reputation for fairness and discipline. Seeing the tension between the two officers, she looked between them with a questioning frown. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her sharp eyes taking in Richard's uncomfortable stance and Kate's firm expression. Kate answered first. "We had a situation at security. Lieutenant Samuel Ross, an Army officer, was held up by Officer Cole here." She nodded toward Richard, not mincing words. The lieutenant provided all his documents, but Officer Cole seemed to think something was off. Captain Benson's expression didn't change, but her eyes flicked over to Richard, taking in his defensive posture. "Is that so?" Richard nodded stiffly. "Yes, Captain. I was just following procedure. Something about him seemed suspicious." Captain Benson held his gaze, her expression hard to read. "And did he provide valid identification and a boarding pass?" Richard hesitated but nodded. "Yes, but Then it sounds like that should have been the end of it, doesn't it?" she said, cutting him off gently but firmly. Richard looked down, feeling his face flush. "I was just being thorough," he mumbled, sounding less certain now. Captain Benson took a deep breath, folding her arms. "Being thorough is part of the job, Richard. But there's a line between caution and unnecessary suspicion, especially when we're dealing with someone who serves the country." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again, realizing he had nothing to say that would change her mind. Captain Benson glanced back toward where Samuel had gone, then back at Richard with a look of disappointment. "Let's step into my office," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I think we need to have a conversation about judgment and respect." Without another word, she turned and began walking toward her office, leaving Richard no choice but to follow. As he walked behind her, Richard felt a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. He'd always prided himself on being a good officer, but this moment felt like a stain on his reputation. He knew Captain Benson wouldn't let this slide. Once inside her office, Captain Benson closed the door and gestured for Richard to sit. She remained standing, her arms crossed as she looked down at him, her gaze steady and serious. "Richard, I've seen you do good work over the years," she began, her tone calm. "But today, I think you let personal biases cloud your judgment. Do you understand how serious that is?" Richard shifted in his chair, feeling uncomfortable under her gaze. "I wasn't trying to be unfair, Captain. Something about him didn't sit right with me." Captain Benson sighed, taking a seat across from him. "And why is that?" What exactly made you feel that way?" Richard looked away, struggling to find an answer. The truth was, he didn't know why he'd reacted so strongly to Samuel. It was just a gut feeling, but as he sat there, he realized how flimsy that sounded. "I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice low. "It was just a feeling." Captain Benson nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch out. "Sometimes feelings aren't enough. In fact, in this job, they can be dangerous. You targeted a man who had done nothing wrong, and even made him feel like he was under attack. How do you think that reflects on us as officers?" Richard didn't answer, his face growing warm with shame. He hadn't considered how his actions might be perceived by others, but now, sitting here in silence, he could see it clearly. Captain Benson continued, her voice softer. "We have a duty to serve and protect everyone with fairness. We can't afford to let personal biases affect our work. Imagine if every officer treated someone like you did today. Think about the damage that would do." Richard nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. He felt the weight of her words settle heavily on him, pressing down with a clarity he hadn't wanted to face. "Now," she said, "I think you should take some time to reflect on this. For now, I'm putting you on temporary leave while we review this incident. You need to understand how your actions affect others, Richard, and I don't think you've fully grasped that yet." Richard felt a pang of shock at her words, but he could tell by her tone that there was no room for argument. He forced himself to nod, swallowing hard. "Yes, Captain," he said quietly, feeling the weight of his own mistakes settling in. Captain Benson nodded back, her expression unreadable. "You're dismissed. Use this time wisely." Richard stood, feeling a strange mix of anger, embarrassment, and regret swirling within him. He left her office with his head down, his mind replaying every moment of his encounter with Samuel. The more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the uncomfortable truth that he'd been unfair and that his actions might have left a lasting impact on an innocent man. As he walked away, he noticed Kate watching him from across the terminal. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told him she'd seen everything. That silent look was the final blow, driving home the reality that his actions had consequences he couldn't just brush aside. Samuel sat in the airport lounge, tapping his fingers lightly on his duffel bag, trying to push the encounter out of his mind. He didn't want this moment, his return home, to be marked by frustration. But no matter how hard he tried, the interaction with Richard weighed on him, reminding him of how often he had to prove himself, even in uniform. A small child nearby tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing at Samuel with wide, curious eyes. The mother smiled apologetically and whispered something to her daughter, who gave Samuel a shy wave. He returned the wave with a warm smile, glad for the small distraction. The moment lightened his mood, even if just for a few seconds. Just then, Samuel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his wife. "We can't wait to see you. Counting down the hours." A smile softened his face, and he quickly typed a reply, letting her know he'd be there soon. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching, and he looked up to see Officer Kate Hernandez standing in front of him. She offered him a gentle, apologetic smile. "Lieutenant Ross," she said, her voice respectful, "I just wanted to say again how sorry I am about what happened earlier. That shouldn't have happened." Samuel nodded, appreciating the gesture. "Thank you, Officer Hernandez. I know it wasn't your doing, but it's hard not to let it get to you." Kate nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of his words. "Richard is, well, he's set in his ways. But that's no excuse. He should have shown you more respect, especially after all you've done for this country." Samuel looked down, thinking. "Respect shouldn't have to come with a uniform or rank," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "It should just be there." Kate sighed, her expression filled with understanding. "You're absolutely right, and I hope you know that not everyone in our department thinks the way he does. A lot of us are grateful for people like you, who do what you do every day." Samuel nodded, giving her a faint smile. "I appreciate that. Truly." They shared a brief, understanding silence, both aware that there was only so much that could be said in the middle of a busy airport. Kate hesitated before continuing. "I know you've been through a lot, Lieutenant. I can only imagine. But if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." Samuel nodded, feeling a sense of relief from her sincerity. "Thank you, Officer Hernandez. I'll be all right. Just need to focus on getting home." Kate gave him a warm smile. "Safe travels, Lieutenant," she said, nodding respectfully before walking away. As she disappeared into the crowd, Samuel found himself feeling a bit lighter. The encounter had left him with a sense of validation that Richard's questioning had tried to strip away. He knew not everyone was like Richard, and Kate's kindness reminded him that empathy still existed, even when he sometimes forgot. But as he glanced down at his watch, a wave of tiredness washed over him. He'd been traveling for hours, and the weight of the past year's deployments lingered in his bones. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and allowed himself a rare moment to relax, letting the noise of the terminal fade into the background. Meanwhile, back in Captain Benson's office, Richard sat silently, wrestling with a mess of emotions. He felt embarrassment, shame, and a stubborn hint of defensiveness all at once. The captain's words replayed in his mind, each one a reminder of how close he was to jeopardizing his career. Captain Benson watched him with a calm, steady gaze, her arms crossed as she leaned against her desk. "Richard, I know this isn't easy to hear," she said, her voice firm yet not unkind. "But you need to understand that this isn't just about one bad decision. It's about what led you to make that decision." Richard shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet her eyes. "Captain, I didn't mean to disrespect him. It's just, well, you know how things are these days. We're told to watch for anything out of the ordinary." Captain Benson raised an eyebrow. "And you think a man in uniform, carrying valid ID and boarding pass, qualifies as out of the ordinary?" Richard paused, realizing how it sounded. No, I guess not." The captain's tone softened, but only slightly. "Richard, we're security officers. We're supposed to keep people safe, but we're also supposed to treat them with dignity. That's a responsibility that comes with the job." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. For the first time, he began to question his own actions, wondering what exactly had made him treat Samuel differently. Deep down, he knew the answer, but he wasn't ready to face it. Captain Benson continued, her voice quieter. "Think about it, Richard. Just think about what led you to act the way you did today. Because until you do, I can't have you back on the floor." With that, she dismissed him, and Richard left the office, feeling a hollowness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. As the hours passed, Samuel finally boarded his connecting flight, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He took his seat by the window, letting out a slow breath as he settled in. The distant city lights sparkled below as the plane lifted off, taking him away from the airport, from the tension, and from the memories of everything that had happened that day. He thought about Kate's words, her kindness a small comfort amid the frustration. And as he looked out over the clouds, he thought of his family, waiting for him on the other side of this journey. That thought, above everything else, kept him steady. Somewhere in the terminal below, Richard sat alone, left to grapple with the uncomfortable truth he'd spent years avoiding. He couldn't shake the memory of Samuel's calm, unwavering gaze, or the feeling of something slipping away. Something he knew he'd have to face, one way or another. The flight home was smooth, and Samuel spent most of it with his eyes closed, allowing his mind to drift. He thought about his wife, Rachel, and their daughter, Leah, imagining the moment he would finally walk through the door and feel their arms around him. The thought brought a smile to his face, and he let himself relax for the first time since leaving the base overseas. When the plane touched down, Samuel felt a rush of anticipation. He gathered his bag, joined the line of passengers exiting the plane, and made his way through the terminal. The airport looked smaller here, quieter than the one he just left, and it felt good to finally be on familiar ground. He walked through the final set of doors and spotted Rachel and Leah waiting just beyond the gate. Leah's face lit up, and she broke into a sprint, arms wide open as she ran toward him. Samuel dropped his bag, bending down just in time to catch her as she launched into his arms. "Daddy!" Leah squealed, holding onto him as tightly as her little arms could manage. Samuel laughed, lifting her up and holding her close. "Hey, baby girl, I missed you so much," he said, his voice soft with relief and joy. Rachel approached, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She reached out and Samuel pulled her into an embrace, holding his family close, grounding himself in the feeling of being home at last. They stood like that for a long moment, the world around them fading into the background. Finally, Rachel pulled back, looking up at him with a soft smile. "Welcome home," she whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Thanks, Rach," he replied, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "It's good to be home." They walked to the parking lot together, Leah chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to show him and the stories she had saved up for his return. Samuel listened, his heart swelling with gratitude for the life he had with them. But as they reached the car and Samuel slid into the passenger seat, a moment of quiet settled between him and Rachel. She glanced over, sensing that something was on his mind. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. Samuel hesitated, not wanting to cast a shadow over this reunion. But he could see in Rachel's eyes that she wouldn't be satisfied with a half-truth. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, mostly. Just something happened back at the airport," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "A security officer held me up, asked a lot of questions. He didn't believe I was really a soldier." Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Why would he think that?" Samuel looked out the window, his jaw tight. "I don't know. Maybe because I don't fit his idea of what a soldier should look like." Rachel reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Sam. That's not right." He nodded, taking comfort in her touch. "It's just frustrating. After everything, you'd think people would understand that there's more to a person than how they look. But I guess some things don't change." Rachel's expression softened and she squeezed his arm. "Well, you're home now. We're here and nothing else matters." Samuel smiled, letting her words sink in. She was right. He was home, with the people who loved him most, and that was what counted. He leaned over and kissed her on the cheek, grateful for her unwavering support. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. They spent the drive home talking about the everyday things they had missed, filling in the gaps left by Samuel's time away. By the time they reached the house, Samuel felt more at peace. He carried Leah inside, and she settled into his lap as they sat on the couch, sharing stories late into the evening. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Richard was alone in his modest apartment, staring at the wall, replaying the day's events in his mind. He'd tried to brush off the uncomfortable feeling that had lingered since his conversation with Captain Benson, but it clung to him, refusing to be ignored. He poured himself a drink, hoping it would ease his thoughts, but the warmth of the whiskey only amplified the questions swirling in his head. Why had he reacted the way he did with Samuel? What had made him so certain something was off about him? The answers he'd given Captain Benson earlier now felt weak, hollow. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair, the silence of his apartment pressing in on him. He'd always believed he was a good officer, someone who upheld the rules, did things by the book. But for the first time, he was forced to confront a truth he hadn't wanted to face, that his instincts might have been nothing more than his own unchecked assumptions. He thought back to the look on Samuel's face, the calm strength with which he'd handled the interrogation, and the way he'd stood his ground without losing control. There had been no fear, only a steady patience, as if he was all too familiar with situations like this. And the realization cut Richard deeper than he wanted to admit. He reached for his phone, opening the contact list. His finger hovered over Kate Hernandez's number. She'd tried to tell him, he remembered. She'd given him a chance to back down, to rethink, but he hadn't listened. Now, with Captain Benson's words and Samuel's expression haunting him, he felt the need to reach out. Finally, he hit call, and after a few rings, Kate answered, her voice filled with surprise. "Richard, is everything okay?" she asked, sounding concerned. "Hey, Kate," he said, his voice low and uncertain. I wanted to apologize for earlier. You were right. I should have thought twice before I did what I did." There was a pause on the other end before Kate spoke, her tone gentle. "I appreciate that, Richard. It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong." He exhaled, feeling a weight lift slightly. "I guess I've got a lot to think about." Kate's voice softened. "We all do sometimes. It's never too late to start doing things differently." Richard nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Thanks, Kate. I needed to hear that." "Any time," she replied warmly. "Take care, Richard, and think about what kind of officer you want to be." He hung up, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt the urge to make a change, not for anyone else's approval, but because he wanted to be better. Over the next few days, Samuel settled back into life at home, finding comfort in the routines he'd missed during his deployment. Mornings were filled with the scent of Rachel's coffee brewing in the kitchen and Leah's excited chatter as she got ready for school. Each day felt like a gift, a reminder of the life he'd built and fought hard to protect. But the incident at the airport remained in the back of his mind. He hadn't told many people about it, not wanting to turn his homecoming into something bitter. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything he'd accomplished, he was still seen by some as a person who didn't belong. It wasn't new. He'd faced similar moments in his life, but each time it left a mark, a quiet reminder of the world's unspoken judgments. One afternoon, as he was putting away some old military gear, his phone buzzed. He glanced down to see a message from a fellow officer, Captain Mitchell, who had heard about what happened at the airport through military channels. Samuel's reputation within the ranks was strong, and the story had reached Mitchell through a friend who worked at the airport precinct. "Hey, Sam, heard about that officer at the airport. If you want, I could look into it. No one should have to go through that." Samuel paused, considering the offer. He trusted Mitchell. He'd served under him for years, and Mitchell had always supported him. But Samuel also knew that pushing back against incidents like this could bring more attention than he wanted. He didn't want to be the subject of discussions he couldn't control, especially when his focus was on reuniting with his family. "Thanks, Mitchell. I appreciate it, but I think I'll handle it on my own," he replied. He set his phone down, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. He wanted to move past this, but he also knew it would take time to shake off. Later that evening, as he sat in the living room with Rachel, he finally spoke up about it. "Mitchell reached out today. He heard about what happened at the airport." Rachel looked up from her book, her brow furrowing. "What did he say?" "He offered to look into it, maybe file a complaint," Samuel replied, his tone neutral. "I told him I'd take care of it myself." Rachel studied him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "Are you sure, Sam? I know you don't like making waves, but sometimes people need to be held accountable. It's not just for you. It's for everyone else who might go through the same thing." Samuel nodded, understanding her concern. "I know, but I also don't want this to turn into something that takes over my life right now. I just got back. I want to enjoy being home without bringing more conflict into our lives." Rachel reached over, taking his hand. "Whatever you decide, I support you. Just promise me you won't let this go if it keeps bothering you." He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Promise." Meanwhile, back at the airport, Richard was going through his own reckoning. Captain Benson's words and Kate's support had left him with a lot to think about, and he'd spent his time on leave in a state of restless introspection. For the first time, he questioned how he'd approached his job all these years, realizing that his tendency to judge too quickly had hurt more than just Samuel. He thought about other people he might have treated with the same unwarranted suspicion, each encounter adding a weight to his conscience. One evening, Richard found himself reaching out to an old friend, Officer Jenkins, who had recently retired from the precinct. Jenkins had been like a mentor to him, guiding him through the early days of his career. If anyone could help him make sense of his feelings, it would be Jenkins. He dialed the number and, after a few rings, heard Jenkins's familiar voice. "Richard, long time no see. How's the precinct treating you?" Richard hesitated, his usual confidence shaken. "Actually, I'm not on duty right now. I've been put on temporary leave." There was a pause on the other end. Then Jenkins's voice softened. "That's rough. What happened?" Richard took a deep breath, laying it out for him. The incident with Samuel, Captain Benson's reprimand, and the uncomfortable realization that he'd acted out of a bias he hadn't even acknowledged before. Jenkins listened quietly, and when Richard finished, he spoke thoughtfully. "Richard, you've always been a good officer. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that this job can twist your perception. You deal with tough situations every day, and sometimes you start seeing threats where there aren't any. You have to work hard to stay fair and open." Richard nodded, absorbing his words. "I thought I was just being careful, doing my job, but I didn't see the line I was crossing." Jenkins chuckled lightly. "The line's a lot harder to see than most people think. It sneaks up on you, especially when you're dealing with people who don't look or act the way you're used to. That's why we have to keep ourselves in check, keep questioning why we do what we do. Otherwise, we risk hurting the very people we're supposed to protect." Richard felt a weight lift, hearing Jenkins's perspective. "Thanks, Jenkins. I think I needed to hear that. I've got a lot to think about." Jenkins's voice grew warm. "Good man. Take the time, Richard. And don't be afraid to apologize when you've messed up. It's a sign of strength, not weakness." They ended the call, and Richard sat in silence for a long time. The next morning, he woke with a clearer sense of purpose. He needed to make things right. A few days later, Samuel was finishing up a run in his neighborhood when his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but something told him to answer. "Hello?" he said, catching his breath. "Lieutenant Ross, this is Officer Richard Cole, from the airport." Samuel stopped, surprised by the name. He hadn't expected to hear from Richard again, and a small part of him felt wary. "Yes, this is Ross. What can I do for you, Officer Cole?" There was a pause on the other end, and Richard's voice, though hesitant, sounded sincere. "I wanted to reach out and apologize for how I treated you at the airport. I know I was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry." Samuel took a moment to let the words sink in, not sure how to respond. He'd rarely received an apology for this kind of treatment, especially not one so direct. After a pause, he replied, "I appreciate the apology, Officer Cole. It's good to hear." Richard's voice held a hint of relief. "Thank you, Lieutenant. And if there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." Samuel thought about it for a moment. "If you're serious, then maybe just remember this. Remember that everyone deserves to be seen as they are, not as you expect them to be. That would mean more to me than anything." Richard nodded, even though Samuel couldn't see him. "I understand, and I'll work on it. Thank you for giving me the chance to apologize." They ended the call, and Samuel felt a surprising sense of closure. The apology didn't erase the frustration or the memory of that day, but it was a step. A small reminder that change was possible, even in the smallest ways. He took a deep breath, looking out at the familiar streets of his neighborhood, feeling a renewed sense of peace. For Richard, the call was the beginning of something new. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time he felt he was heading in the right direction. Days passed, and Samuel finally began to feel fully at ease, the strain of his last deployment fading as he settled into his routine with Rachel and Leah. The experience at the airport still lingered, but Richard's apology had offered a sense of peace he hadn't expected. It was rare for him to receive such acknowledgement, and even rarer for it to come from someone in Richard's position. Samuel appreciated the courage it must have taken for Richard to reach out. One evening, as Samuel was helping Leah with her math homework, Rachel entered the room, her phone in hand and a thoughtful expression on her face. "Sam, you've got a message from the airport precinct," she said, passing him her phone. "It's from Captain Laura Benson. I guess they reached out through the family support network." Samuel frowned, surprised. "Captain Benson?" he repeated, taking the phone and reading the message. The message was brief but respectful. "Lieutenant Ross, I'm Captain Laura Benson, head of airport security. I'm reaching out to formally apologize for the incident involving Officer Cole. We're addressing this matter internally and implementing new training for our team to prevent similar situations in the future. If you're open to it, I'd appreciate an opportunity to speak with you and gain your insights. Thank you for your time and your service." Samuel read the message twice, a mixture of emotions stirring within him. It wasn't often that someone in Captain Benson's position took the time to reach out personally. He knew it was likely part of her effort to address the situation, but there was something in the tone of her message that felt genuine, almost earnest. Rachel watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Samuel sighed, setting the phone down. "I'm not sure. Part of me wants to just move on and leave this in the past. But I know if people don't speak up, things don't change. Maybe this is a chance to make a difference." Rachel nodded, her gaze supportive. "You're right, and maybe this Captain Benson wants to make things right. You could help her see what really needs to change." Samuel considered her words. He respected Captain Benson for reaching out directly, and if she was sincere, then this could be an opportunity for positive change, not just for him, but for others who might face the same treatment. After a moment, he decided to respond. "Thank you, Captain Benson. I appreciate your message. I'd be willing to meet and share my thoughts. Let me know what time works best for you." He hit send, feeling a quiet sense of resolve settle within him. Rachel placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her expression warm with pride. "Whatever happens, Sam, I'm proud of you." He gave her a small smile. "Thanks, Rach. I just hope it makes a difference." The next afternoon, Samuel arrived at the airport precinct for his meeting with Captain Benson. It felt strange returning to the place where the incident had happened, but this time, he walked in with a sense of purpose. He was greeted by a young officer who escorted him through the hallways to Captain Benson's office. Captain Benson greeted him at the door, extending a hand with a respectful nod. "Lieutenant Ross, thank you for coming. I appreciate your time." Samuel shook her hand, nodding. "Thank you for reaching out, Captain." They took seats across from each other in her modest office. Captain Benson leaned forward, her expression sincere. "I wanted to start by apologizing directly. What happened with Officer Cole was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring that it doesn't happen again. We're implementing additional training on bias and de-escalation to help prevent situations like this in the future." Samuel listened, appreciating her direct approach. "I appreciate that, Captain. I'm here because I believe things can improve, and I respect that you're willing to address this head-on." Captain Benson nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you. I'd like to hear from you about what you think could help us be better. I know you've faced situations like this before, but I want to understand how we can make real changes." Samuel thought carefully, choosing his words. "The truth is, what happened with Officer Cole wasn't unique. I've dealt with suspicion before, even in uniform. People see what they expect to see, not who someone truly is. I think it's important that officers understand that everyone has a story, and respect should come first." Captain Benson nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what we need to work on. I want my team to know that we can't judge based on surface impressions. It's about giving people the benefit of the doubt and treating them with dignity, even when we're being vigilant." Samuel nodded in agreement. "That's exactly it. I know your officers deal with challenging situations, but when judgment clouds fairness, it breaks down trust. And trust is everything." Captain Benson sighed, her face reflecting her dedication. "Trust, yes. That's what we've risked losing, and it's what I want to rebuild." She looked him in the eye, her tone softer. "If you're open to it, Lieutenant, I'd like to invite you to speak to some of our officers. I think they would benefit from hearing your perspective directly." Samuel considered her offer. It would take him out of his comfort zone, but he saw the value in her request. "I'd be willing to do that," he replied. "If it can help even one person think differently, then it's worth it." Captain Benson smiled, a genuine expression of gratitude. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I think this could make a real difference." A week later, Samuel found himself standing in front of a small group of airport security officers, including Captain Benson, Kate Hernandez, and, surprisingly, Richard Cole. The atmosphere in the room was quiet, respectful, and Samuel could feel the weight of each person's attention on him. He cleared his throat, glancing at Captain Benson, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm Lieutenant Samuel Ross, and I've been serving in the Army for the past 10 years. I've deployed multiple times, and coming home is always something I look forward to. But what happened here reminded me that sometimes the hardest battles aren't on the battlefield. They're right here at home." The officers listened intently, a few shifting uncomfortably as he spoke. Richard, in particular, kept his gaze lowered, visibly moved by Samuel's words. "I know you're all here to protect and keep this place safe," Samuel continued, his tone steady. "But we have to remember that not everyone who looks different or stands out is a threat. People like me, in uniform or out of it, just want to feel respected. It's a basic dignity we all deserve." He paused, looking around the room, letting his words settle. "If there's one thing I'd ask, it's this. Give people a chance to be seen for who they are, not just who you think they might be. I believe in the work you're doing, and I know it's not easy, but respect should be at the heart of it." After a moment of silence, Captain Benson stood and led the room in a round of applause. Richard looked up, catching Samuel's eye, and nodded, his expression full of gratitude and a hint of regret. When the session ended, Richard approached Samuel, his face earnest. "Lieutenant Ross, thank you for everything. I know I still have a lot to learn, but I'll remember what you said." Samuel extended his hand, and Richard shook it firmly. "Thank you, Officer Cole. Change isn't easy, but taking the first step matters." As Samuel walked out of the precinct that day, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He hadn't just returned home, he'd helped pave the way for a shift in perspective, a small but meaningful victory. Samuel returned to his life at home with a renewed sense of peace. The experience at the airport precinct had been more meaningful than he'd expected, and he hoped that sharing his story with the officers had left an impact. Rachel could see the shift in him. There was a lightness in his step, a deeper calm that hadn't been there before. One evening, as Samuel and Rachel sat on the back porch watching Leah play in the yard, Rachel turned to him with a smile. "You seem more at ease now, Sam." "Like something's lifted." Samuel nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I think it has. Talking to those officers, especially to Richard, it made me feel like maybe things can change, even in small ways. If I've made them think twice about how they judge people, then it was worth it." Rachel took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you, Sam. You took something painful and turned it into something good. That's not easy." He gave her a small smile, grateful for her words. "I had to do it. For people like Leah, for her future. I don't want her growing up in a world where people are judged by their appearance first. If I can make even a small difference now, maybe it'll mean a better world for her later." They sat in silence for a while, watching Leah's laughter fill the air as she ran around chasing fireflies. Samuel's heart swelled with a quiet joy, and he felt grounded, content in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. At the airport precinct, the changes Samuel had helped spark were already taking shape. Captain Benson, true to her word, had arranged for more training focused on respect, bias awareness, and de-escalation. Officers were given the opportunity to learn from guest speakers, including veterans, community leaders, and even behavioral experts. It wasn't an overnight shift, but each training session built a new layer of understanding. For Richard, the process of change was both challenging and humbling. Every day, He came face to face with moments where he'd have once made quick judgments. Now, he forced himself to pause, to consider his assumptions before acting. There were times when he slipped, finding old habits creeping in, but he was determined to do better. The memory of Samuel's calm, dignified expression continued to guide him, reminding him of the man he wanted to become. One afternoon, after a particularly reflective training session, Richard found himself crossing paths with Kate Hernandez in the precinct hallway. She offered him a small smile, clearly noticing the effort he was making. "Hey, Richard," she said, her tone warm. "I've been meaning to say I'm glad to see you taking this seriously. I know it's not easy to make a change like this." Richard sighed, his expression thoughtful. "It's not, but it's worth it. Samuel made me see things differently. I don't think I'd realized how many times I'd let my guard down to assumptions. It's hard to face, honestly." Kate nodded, understanding. "I get it. We all have our blind spots, but it takes real strength to confront them. Most people wouldn't even try." They stood there for a moment, a mutual respect forming between them that hadn't been there before. Richard felt a weight lift, knowing he wasn't alone in his journey to change. Meanwhile, Samuel received another message from Captain Benson, this time thanking him for his talk with the officers. She included an update on the new programs and asked if he'd be willing to stay connected as an advisor for any future initiatives. Samuel was both surprised and honored. He'd never thought his experience would lead to something like this, but he could see the value in maintaining the connection. He discussed it with Rachel, who encouraged him to keep the line open. "You have a unique perspective, Sam," she told him. "If Captain Benson wants your input, that means she trusts your voice. Think of the people you could help." Samuel agreed, realizing that he could make a difference even from a distance. He replied to Captain Benson, letting her know he'd be open to offering his perspective whenever needed. She responded quickly, expressing her gratitude and reinforcing her commitment to meaningful change. A few weeks later, Samuel was at a neighborhood gathering, a small barbecue organized by a few friends. He was chatting with some of the neighbors when one of them, James, a retired Navy veteran, approached him with a curious expression. "Hey, Sam," James said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I heard you spoke to a group of airport officers recently. I've got to say, it's good to see someone setting them straight. People forget how much those biases can affect us." Samuel gave a modest nod. "Yeah, it was an unexpected opportunity, but I'm glad it happened." They seemed open to hearing a different perspective. James nodded, his eyes serious. "It's about time. I had my own run-ins over the years. Even in uniform, it's like some people can't see past what they expect to see. But I respect that you're working to change that. Takes guts." Samuel appreciated the sentiment, feeling a sense of solidarity. "Thanks, James. It's slow, but I think if people are willing to listen, that's already a step in the right direction." They continued talking, and as the evening went on, more neighbors joined the conversation. Many of them shared similar stories, moments where they'd felt overlooked, misjudged, or dismissed. Samuel listened to each story, realizing just how many people carried these experiences, often in silence. It made him even more certain that he'd made the right choice by speaking out. When the night drew to a close, Samuel and Rachel walked back home together under the quiet night sky. She slipped her arm through his, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I think you're making more of a difference than you even realize, Sam," she whispered, her voice full of pride. "Look at how many people were affected just by hearing your story. Imagine the impact you're making at that precinct." Samuel looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace. He hadn't set out to change anything, yet somehow the events at the airport had led him to a path of purpose he hadn't anticipated. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he was ready to face it, knowing he had his family's love and support. In the weeks that followed, Samuel continued his life with a new awareness, one rooted in a desire to foster understanding and respect. The changes at the precinct were gradual, but each step felt like progress, a reminder that transformation, however slow, was still transformation. And every now and then, He received updates from Captain Benson, who kept him informed on the trainings and programs they were implementing. She sent him short notes on Richard's progress too, noting how he was taking each session to heart, steadily evolving into a more compassionate, thoughtful officer. Samuel found comfort in these updates, knowing that, in a quiet but meaningful way, his experience had been a catalyst for growth. It wasn't a grand transformation, but it was real, and he hoped that over time, others would feel the difference. For now, though, he was content to be home, cherishing the moments with Rachel and Leah, knowing that he had done what he could to create a ripple that, with time, might turn into a wave. Months passed, and Samuel's life returned to a peaceful rhythm. He spent his days reconnecting with his family, working with local veterans groups, and savoring the ordinary moments he had missed during his time away. The changes at the airport precinct faded into the background as he focused on the things closest to his heart. One evening, as he sat reading in the living room, his phone buzzed with a familiar notification sound. It was another message from Captain Benson. "Lieutenant Ross, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to share an update with you. Officer Cole has requested a meeting with you. He's expressed a desire to speak in person. I understand if you're not comfortable with this, but he seems sincere in wanting to discuss the changes he's been going through. Let me know if you'd be open to it." Respectfully, Captain Laura Benson Samuel read the message slowly, absorbing each word. Richard Cole. He hadn't expected to hear from him again. Their last conversation had felt like closure, and he had moved forward without any expectation of further contact. But the idea that Richard wanted to meet in person intrigued him. He could sense that this was important to Richard, not just a formality. He turned the idea over in his mind, unsure how he felt. Part of him wanted to let it go, to avoid stirring up emotions he'd worked hard to process. But another part of him felt a sense of responsibility. If Richard was truly committed to change, maybe this meeting could be a step forward, not just for Richard, but for both of them. After a long pause, he typed a response. "Thank you, Captain. I would be willing to meet with Officer Cole. Let's set up a time that works for both of us." The message was brief, but it held all he needed to say. He sent it, knowing he was ready to see where this next conversation would take them. The following week, Samuel walked into a small, quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Captain Benson had arranged the meeting in a neutral location, one that would allow both men to speak freely. He spotted Richard seated at a corner table, his expression tense, and his hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee. Richard looked up as Samuel approached, giving a hesitant nod. "Lieutenant Ross," he said, standing to shake Samuel's hand. "Thank you for meeting me." Samuel accepted the handshake, his grip firm but calm. "Of course, Officer Cole. I appreciate you reaching out." They both took a seat, and a moment of silence settled between them, the quiet hum of the coffee shop filling the space as they gathered their thoughts. Richard was the first to speak. I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day," he began, his voice measured as if choosing each word carefully. "I thought I understood everything there was to know about my job, about the people I deal with every day. But what happened with you? Well, it made me realize I'd been doing things wrong for a long time." Samuel nodded, listening intently. He could see the sincerity in Richard's eyes, the struggle to express something he wasn't used to sharing. Richard continued, his gaze steady. "I didn't know how deep my assumptions ran. I thought I was just being cautious, but I've come to realize that what I thought was caution was really a lack of understanding. I didn't see you for who you were, Samuel. I only saw my own fears, and that's not who I want to be anymore." Samuel appreciated his openness and decided to respond just as honestly. "I could tell you were acting on assumptions, Richard, and it's frustrating, especially for people who have been judged before they've even had a chance to prove who they are. But I can see that you're making an effort now. That matters." Richard looked down, visibly moved. "Since that day, I've tried to make changes. I went through every training session Captain Benson recommended, took every lesson to heart, but I still feel like I have a long way to go. I wanted to meet with you because I wanted you to know that your words didn't just fall on deaf ears. They changed the way I see my role and myself." Samuel smiled slightly. "That's good to hear. We're all human, Richard. We make mistakes, and we grow from them. What matters is the choice to learn, to make sure those mistakes don't repeat themselves. It's not an easy path, but it's worth it." Richard nodded slowly, looking out the window as he absorbed Samuel's words. "I still think about the way you looked at me that day, the way you stood there calm even though I was treating you like a criminal. I don't know how you managed to stay so composed." Samuel gave a thoughtful shrug. "You learn to handle it over time, but that doesn't make it right. Just because people grow used to being misjudged doesn't mean they should be." Richard took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right. I see that now. I'm working on it, Samuel. Every day I'm trying to do better, to remember the lesson you taught me. I just hope it makes a difference in the long run." Samuel looked him in the eyes, recognizing the genuine effort behind his words. Change takes time, but every step forward counts. If you keep going, keep learning, then you're already making a difference. They sat in silence for a few moments, letting the words settle between them. Then Richard spoke again, his tone softer. "Thank you for giving me this chance, Lieutenant. I know I didn't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Samuel nodded, a small but warm smile crossing his face. "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right, Richard. I'm glad you took it." They finished their coffees, and as they stood to leave, Richard extended his hand once more. This time, Samuel could feel the respect and sincerity behind the gesture. "Thank you, Samuel," Richard said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." Samuel shook his hand, feeling a sense of closure. "Take care, Richard, and keep moving forward." As they walked out of the coffee shop and went their separate ways, Samuel felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but he'd helped someone else see the world a little differently. And that, he realized, was worth every challenge he'd faced. For Richard, the meeting had been a turning point, a chance to put his words into action, to keep building on the changes he'd begun. He knew there was still work to be done, but he walked away feeling lighter, knowing he was no longer alone in his commitment to growth. In that small coffee shop, two men had met as strangers, but they'd left as something more, with a mutual understanding that was more powerful than words could express. In the weeks that followed, Samuel found himself reflecting often on his meeting with Richard. He hadn't expected Richard's journey toward change to resonate with him so deeply. The entire experience had not only challenged his patience, but also reinforced his own commitment to promoting understanding and respect in every sphere of his life. One evening, while sharing dinner with Rachel and Leah, his phone rang. Seeing Captain Benson's name flash on the screen, he gave Rachel an apologetic smile and answered. "Lieutenant Ross, sorry to interrupt your evening." Captain Benson's voice was calm yet purposeful. "I wanted to reach out personally. We've been making progress with our new training initiatives, and the impact is already clear, but I have something else I wanted to discuss with you." Samuel nodded, intrigued. "Of course, Captain. What's on your mind?" Captain Benson took a deep breath. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider working with us on a more consistent basis, as a consultant. We've seen firsthand how your experiences and insight have influenced the team, and I believe you could help guide this transformation further. This isn't just about training. It's about changing the culture. I understand this is a lot to consider, but you have a gift for connecting with people in ways that stick." Samuel felt a spark of excitement mingled with caution. He had been content helping from a distance, believing his part was largely done. But hearing the sincerity in Captain Benson's voice, he knew she was genuinely committed to making this a lasting change. He glanced over at Rachel, who was watching him with a curious but supportive expression. "I appreciate the offer, Captain," he replied thoughtfully. "This isn't something I'd take lightly. I'd have to discuss it with my family, but I'm interested." Captain Benson's relief was palpable even over the phone. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Take all the time you need. This is a big commitment, but I truly believe you could help us shape something meaningful here." They ended the call, and Samuel turned back to Rachel, who raised an eyebrow, waiting for an explanation. "She wants me to work with the precinct as a consultant," he explained. "They're committed to pushing this training further, to creating real change. She thinks I could make a difference." Rachel considered his words, then reached over to place a hand on his. "Sam, you already have made a difference. But if this is something that would give you a sense of purpose, something that could keep that difference alive, then I think you should go for it." Samuel squeezed her hand, feeling the encouragement he'd come to rely on from her. "I think it could be something important. I want to help them get it right." Rachel smiled, nodding. "Then we're with you." A month later, Samuel began his role as a consultant with the airport precinct. His new position allowed him to work closely with Captain Benson, observing training sessions, meeting with officers, and helping to develop new strategies to address biases and promote fairness. He realized that his voice, his unique perspective, held weight, and he intended to use it to build something that would last. The precinct's training program evolved under his guidance, focusing on understanding implicit biases, the importance of respectful communication, and the impact of empathy. Samuel also emphasized de-escalation tactics, helping officers recognize how certain reactions could escalate a situation unnecessarily. With each session, he noticed shifts in the officers, seeing their perspectives widen and their actions change. Richard, in particular, showed remarkable growth. Samuel often found him volunteering for extra sessions or staying late to talk with other officers about his own experiences. It was clear Richard was deeply committed to improving himself and supporting his colleagues in doing the same. The once cynical officer was becoming a role model, and Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. One day, after a particularly engaging session, Richard approached Samuel with a smile, his tone light yet grateful. "Lieutenant, I think I owe you another thank you. I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't had that wake-up call. These past few months have been eye-opening." Samuel smiled back, feeling a genuine warmth toward him. "I think you did most of the work, Richard. You made the choice to be better." Richard chuckled, looking down thoughtfully. "Well, it helps to have a good teacher." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep moving forward, Richard. That's all any of us can do." As time went on, Samuel's work with the precinct began attracting attention beyond the airport. Community leaders took notice of the changes in the precinct's approach, noting the positive impact on travelers and the way officers handled situations. Word spread, and other departments began asking Captain Benson about their methods, seeking guidance on implementing similar initiatives. Captain Benson, in turn, credited Samuel's influence, acknowledging that his perspective had brought a unique and essential shift in the way her officers saw their responsibilities. One afternoon, during a community event hosted by the precinct, Samuel was invited to speak. As he stood before the gathered crowd, including local leaders, officers, and families, he felt the gravity of the moment. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I first joined this precinct as a consultant, I wasn't sure what to expect, but what I found was a group of dedicated officers, people who were willing to look inward and ask difficult questions. They chose to change not because they had to, but because they wanted to serve their community with greater integrity." He looked around at the faces before him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. What we're building here isn't just a training program or a set of guidelines. It's a commitment to see each other as people first, to recognize the dignity in everyone who walks through these doors. The crowd listened in rapt silence, and Samuel continued, "Change isn't easy. It takes time, patience, and the willingness to confront our own blind spots. But if we keep moving forward, keep striving to be better, then we're creating a future where respect and understanding are the foundation of everything we do." He finished his speech to a wave of applause, the impact of his words evident in the faces around him. Captain Benson approached him after, her expression filled with respect. "Thank you, Samuel," she said quietly. "I don't think we could have done this without you." Samuel nodded, humbled. "Thank you for believing in this, Captain, for believing in me." The weeks turned into months and the changes at the precinct continued to take root. Samuel eventually stepped back from his consultant role, having helped lay a strong foundation. He knew the precinct was in good hands with Captain Benson and the officers who had embraced the transformation. When he finally said his goodbyes, Richard was there, along with Kate and several other officers who had been part of the journey from the beginning. Richard shook his hand firmly, a look of genuine gratitude in his eyes. "You've changed things here, Samuel." "Thank you," he said quietly. Samuel gave him a warm smile. "Just keep moving forward. That's all I ask." As he walked out of the precinct one last time, Samuel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey that had begun with an unfair confrontation had ended with respect, growth, and a community transformed. He knew that the work he'd done would continue to ripple out, affecting lives in ways he might never see. Back home with Rachel and Leah, he returned to the quiet, ordinary life he had longed for, his heart full. He had come home not only to his family but to a new purpose, a chance to help build a world that was a little kinder, a little fairer. And he knew that, for as long as he lived, he would carry the lessons of this journey with him, knowing he had made a difference that would last. Months turned into a year, and the impact of Samuel's work with the precinct continued to echo throughout the community. Officers who had been part of the training shared their experiences openly, sparking conversations in other departments about respect, fairness, and the value of second chances. Even other precincts started reaching out to Captain Benson for insights on implementing similar programs. Samuel, now fully back into family life, focused on his work with local veterans and occasionally offered his perspective to community groups interested in improving relationships with law enforcement. His role as a quiet but steady force for change had become known in his community, and he was respected not only for his service but for his unwavering commitment to justice and understanding. One summer afternoon, Samuel and Rachel decided to take Leah to the park for a family picnic. The day was warm and bright, with a soft breeze rustling through the trees. They spread a blanket out under a large oak tree, laughing as Leah ran around with other kids, her joyful energy filling the air. Samuel and Rachel watched her, their fingers intertwined as they soaked in the peace of the moment. As they settled in, a familiar face approached from across the park. It was Richard Cole, dressed casually, and he held the hand of a young boy who looked around Leah's age. Richard spotted Samuel and waved with a friendly smile, a sense of ease in his manner that Samuel hadn't seen before. "Lieutenant Ross," Richard greeted warmly, using the title almost as a term of respect rather than formality. "Good to see you. Didn't expect to run into you here." "Just Sam now," Samuel replied with a grin, standing to shake Richard's hand. "Good to see you too, Richard. Out with the family?" Richard nodded, gesturing to the boy. "This is my son, Leo. Thought I'd bring him out for some fresh air. And looks like he's found some company," he added, noticing Leo shyly waving to Leah, who waved back with a friendly smile. Rachel smiled warmly, introducing herself and motioning for them to join their picnic. Richard hesitated briefly but then accepted, sitting down with them on the blanket, the two families naturally sharing the space as they watched their kids play nearby. "Sam, I can't thank you enough for everything," Richard said after a moment of comfortable silence. "You know, before all this, I would have never thought about the things we've talked about, the perspectives I'd been missing. But now, it's like I can't not see it. I know I've still got more to learn, but I'm better for it. And so is my family." Samuel looked at him with a thoughtful smile. "Change is a journey, Richard, and it's not about perfection. It's about progress. The fact that you're willing to keep learning makes all the difference." Richard nodded, visibly moved by Samuel's words. "I never realized how much I'd been carrying, how much I was holding on to old ideas that weren't doing me or anyone else any good. Letting go of that has been freeing. Rachel, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. It's amazing, really. Change can be hard, but it's moments like these that show it's worth it. Watching people grow and become more open. It gives me hope. They continued to talk, sharing stories about their families and laughing at the kids' antics as Leah and Leo played a game of tag nearby. Richard, once so guarded, now opened up easily, revealing a warmth and humility that had emerged from the journey he'd taken since that day at the airport. After a while, Richard glanced at Samuel, a thought crossing his mind. You know, Sam, I've been thinking about how many other officers out there might need the same opportunity I had. I wish every department could have someone like you to show them what they're missing. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. One step at a time. The important thing is that people are willing to try. Richard smiled, his eyes reflecting a newfound purpose. Well, if there's ever anything I can do to help, just say the word. You've done so much for me. I'd be honored to pay it forward. They continued talking as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park. The kids ran back to the blanket, faces flushed from play, and settled in with snacks and juice boxes. Leah and Leo chatted easily, sharing stories as if they'd known each other forever, their laughter filling the air. As the evening wore on, the two families packed up, saying their goodbyes with promises to meet up again soon. Watching Richard and Leo walk away, Samuel felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that this wasn't just an ending but a continuation, a new chapter for people like Richard, who were now committed to fostering understanding and respect. Back in the car with his family, Samuel looked out the window, watching the park recede into the distance. Rachel reached over and placed a comforting hand on his, giving him a proud smile. You know, Sam, you've done more than just help one person. You've shown a whole community what it means to believe in change. Samuel squeezed her hand, his heart full. I think it's just the beginning, Rach. Maybe we've all got something to learn, a way to grow if we're willing to listen. As they drove home, a quiet sense of peace settled over him. He was right where he needed to be, surrounded by love and purpose, ready for whatever lay ahead. And with that thought, he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the setting sun fill him with hope for the future. Over the following months, Samuel's impact continued to ripple throughout the community. He became a respected figure, not only among the officers he had worked with, but also within the broader local community. Schools, community centers, and even churches invited him to speak, eager for the insight and humility he brought to difficult topics. Samuel, once reserved about sharing his experiences, found himself embracing these opportunities, seeing them as a way to plant seeds of understanding and change. One crisp autumn evening, Samuel was invited to speak at a town hall event focused on community relations. Rachel and Leah joined him, sitting in the audience as he took the stage. The hall was filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, a diverse crowd that was eager to hear his perspective. As he stood at the podium, Samuel took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. He recognized several familiar faces: Captain Benson, Officer Kate Hernandez, and even Richard, who gave him a supportive nod from the back row. Thank you all for being here tonight, Samuel began, his voice steady but filled with warmth. I'm here because of something we all share, a desire for a community where people are respected, understood, and valued for who they are, not for the assumptions others make about them. The crowd listened intently as he continued, sharing parts of his journey and the lessons he had learned along the way. He spoke openly about the pain of being misjudged, the challenges of overcoming biases, and the powerful transformation that could happen when people opened their minds and hearts to each other. What I've learned, he said, his tone calm yet firm, is that respect isn't just something we offer to people we know or understand. True respect is what we give even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges our assumptions. It's seeing beyond the surface and choosing to recognize the humanity in each person we meet. He paused, letting the words settle in the room, and noticed several people nodding, visibly moved. Samuel continued, None of this is easy, change never is. But if each of us can be brave enough to question our own biases, to listen a little more deeply, then we're already creating a better world, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. As he finished, the audience erupted into applause, and Samuel saw tears in a few people's eyes, including Rachel's. He glanced at Leah, who beamed at him, her pride unmistakable. Samuel knew that moments like this, where hearts and minds came together, were the reason he had chosen to speak up in the first place. After the event, people approached him to share their own stories, moments when they had been judged or when they had realized their own need to grow. Richard made his way through the crowd and shook Samuel's hand, a look of admiration on his face. "Sam, you're really making a difference," he said quietly. "Listening to you tonight, it reminded me how important it is to keep moving forward, to never stop trying." Samuel smiled, clapping Richard on the shoulder. "You're part of that difference too, Richard. We're all in this together." As the crowd began to disperse, Captain Benson approached him, her face filled with gratitude. "Samuel, I just want to thank you once again. Because of you, we're seeing real changes, not just in our precinct, but in the way our entire community interacts." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you, Captain. I think we've all grown because of this journey." The next day, Samuel went back to his usual routine, but the impact of the previous night lingered in his heart. He knew the work he'd done mattered, and that his family and community stood with him. Rachel noticed the thoughtful look on his face as he sipped his morning coffee and smiled. "You know, Sam, I think last night was just the beginning," she said softly. "People see you as someone they can trust, someone they can learn from. That's something special." Samuel looked at her, feeling the love and pride radiating from her words. "I think you're right, Rach. And as long as I can help people see each other more clearly, then that's what I'll keep doing." She reached out, taking his hand. "You've always been a quiet leader, Sam, but now people are finally seeing it too." He squeezed her hand, his heart full. He didn't know where this journey would lead him next, but he knew he'd continue to carry the lessons he'd learned, sharing them wherever they could make a difference. Later that day, Samuel took a walk through the neighborhood, reflecting on all that had happened over the past year. He passed by the local park, watching as children played and families laughed together. The world felt a little brighter, a little warmer, and he couldn't help but feel that in some small way, he had contributed to that. As he reached the edge of the park, he spotted a young man wearing a military uniform, standing alone by the entrance, looking unsure. Samuel approached him with a smile. "First time back home?" he asked gently, recognizing the nervous energy in the young man's stance. The young soldier looked at him, surprised, and nodded. "Yes, sir, it feels strange. Good, but strange." Samuel chuckled, nodding. "I know that feeling well. Just remember, you're not alone. And if you ever need a reminder of that, there are people here who understand." The young man relaxed, a grateful smile breaking across his face. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Samuel patted him on the shoulder, feeling a sense of kinship. As he walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the work he had started, the lessons he'd shared, were already spreading through his community. He returned home that evening, content, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. With Rachel and Leah by his side, and the support of a community that valued his voice, Samuel felt a quiet assurance that the changes he had helped spark would continue to grow, carrying forward a legacy of respect, compassion, and understanding. The journey had been long, filled with challenges and unexpected turns, but as he looked back, he knew that every step had been worth it. And in the end, he had found something even greater than justice or recognition. He had found a way to make the world a little better, one conversation at a time. As the years passed, Samuel's life continued to be shaped by the values he had come to hold dear: compassion, respect, and the quiet courage to confront biases. His efforts had planted seeds throughout the community, inspiring others to see the world through a broader lens. He remained involved with the precinct's training programs, though his role gradually transitioned from active consultant to honored guest, as Captain Benson and her team carried on the work he had helped initiate. The changes within the precinct became a point of pride for the entire community. Other departments began to model their own training programs after what Captain Benson and her team had built, turning Samuel's influence into something lasting, something real. Samuel found that his impact, while quietly woven into the lives of many, had sparked a culture shift that touched people in ways he hadn't imagined. One winter morning, Samuel received an invitation to attend an awards ceremony at the airport precinct. The invitation was vague, signed simply by Captain Benson, who had hinted that he should bring Rachel and Leah along. He was curious, but Rachel seemed to know more than she was letting on, smiling knowingly as they dressed up for the occasion. When they arrived, Samuel was surprised to see the precinct lobby filled with officers, community leaders, and even familiar faces from his early days as a consultant. Captain Benson greeted him warmly, shaking his hand before ushering him and his family toward the front of the room. As the room quieted, Captain Benson took the podium, her voice steady with pride. Today, we gather not just to recognize one individual, but to honor the values he has inspired in each of us. Lieutenant Samuel Ross came into our lives when we needed him most. He gave us the courage to question our assumptions, to see each other more clearly, and to commit ourselves to a standard of respect and understanding that continues to shape our work. She gestured toward Samuel, her eyes bright with gratitude. Samuel, you changed this precinct, and in doing so, you changed us. It's my honor to present you with this Community Leadership Award, a small token of our gratitude for all you have done. The crowd erupted into applause as Captain Benson handed Samuel a beautifully crafted plaque, engraved with his name, and a simple but powerful message: for outstanding service in fostering respect, understanding, and unity in our community. Samuel took a deep breath, humbled by the honor. He glanced over at Rachel, who beamed with pride, and at Leah, who looked up at him with admiration. Turning back to the crowd, he took a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I first came to this precinct, I didn't expect any of this. I was just trying to be heard, to stand up for something I believed in. But what I found was a community willing to listen, to grow, and to make a real change. This award represents each of you, the work you've done, and the respect you've chosen to show, even when it was difficult." He paused, letting his words settle. "The work we've done here isn't just about one precinct or one person. It's about creating a future where everyone feels seen and valued, where respect is the foundation of everything we do. I'm grateful to have been a part of that, and I hope each of you carries this commitment forward, sharing it with others and inspiring even more change." The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt, filled with the appreciation of people who had come to know him not only as a leader, but as a friend. As he stepped down from the podium, a wave of familiar faces approached him, offering their congratulations and gratitude. Richard Cole was among them, his face alight with pride. "Sam, you deserve this more than anyone. Thank you for everything. Because of you, I know I'm a better officer and a better person." Samuel smiled, gripping Richard's hand. "Thank you, Richard. It's been an honor watching you grow." As the ceremony continued, Samuel felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had come full circle, from a difficult experience at the airport to becoming a trusted figure in a place he once felt misunderstood. This recognition, though deeply meaningful, was not the end. It was simply a marker along a path he would continue to walk. That evening, as he and Rachel sat together on their porch, watching the stars, she took his hand, her eyes reflecting the quiet joy of their shared journey. "You did it, Sam," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "You took something painful and turned it into something beautiful." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I couldn't have done it alone. It's the people who believed in this change, people like you, Leah, and even Richard, who made it possible." Rachel smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "No matter where life takes us, You'll always be someone who made a difference." As they sat together, the stars twinkling above them, Samuel felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. He had found a way to leave a legacy that would continue long after he was gone, a legacy built on respect, understanding, and the quiet but powerful courage to see people as they truly were. In that moment, with his family by his side, and the knowledge that he had changed lives for the better, Samuel knew he was right where he was meant to be. The journey had come full circle, leaving him not only a respected leader but, more importantly, a man at peace with the life he had chosen to live. And as he watched the stars, he felt a deep and abiding gratitude, knowing he had done his part to make the world a little kinder, a little more just, one choice at a time. If this story moved you, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We've got more powerful stories coming your way. Stay tuned.